Hi, welcome to Enemy Zero Studios review project, Sega Saturn review project, where I am going to review every single US released Sega Saturn game for the channel. So let's go ahead and get it started with Albert Odyssey: Legend of Eldeen.
Many years have passed since Albert left his heroic mark on history, and the peace that once was is no more.
Albert Odyssey: Legend of Eldeen is a classic turn-based JRPG which was released on the Sega Saturn in 1996. It was developed by Sunsoft, who made some really classic games in the Nintendo era, like Blaster Master and a couple of the Nintendo Batman games, amongst many others. Sunsoft had a pretty huge game library back in the day, but shortly after the release of this Albert Odyssey in Japan, Sunsoft as a company was essentially shut down. The game was later localized and published by Working Designs in the US market, who specialize in niche, at least at the time, RPG translations, JRPG translations. Sunsoft still does live on a little bit in today's gaming world, but it's name only. You'll see the name pop up once in a while with, their old IPs and stuff like that. But as a company, I don't believe that they do anything nowadays. They're definitely gone. And Albert Odyssey had the pleasure of being one of the first Working Designs games that I ever owned, because I did not own a Sega CD when it was out. My family could not afford such grainy FMV luxury as the Sega CD. So I actually never played any of the early Working Designs games translated on the Sega CD. So the Sega Saturn was my introduction to the company. They're very much known for their quirky translations and their really cool packaging, and for actually improving the games they translate and localize into, English. And I loved Working Designs for that, especially the packaging. The packaging is ballin'. The packaging has got that, that foil cover, translation notes in the back. It's delectable. And now Albert Odyssey: Legend of Eldeen was also a sequel in a sense, even though this is the only one that ever came to America. And it was more of a side story to the series, I guess. The original Albert Odyssey and Albert Odyssey 2 came out in Japan only on the Super Nintendo. And actually, Legend of Eldeen was actually originally going to be a Super Nintendo game, but it was canceled late in the lifespan of the Super Nintendo, and they remade it essentially for the Sega Saturn. And that leads to some of the disadvantages of the game a little bit, which we'll talk about later. But with this third edition of Albert Odyssey, they actually really changed up the gameplay for this one, as it was turned into a traditional turn-based JRPG battle system. The original two on the Super Nintendo were more of a strategy tactics type game. So this definitely was a departure, and that's why people call it sort of a side story. In Japan, it had Gaiden in the name, Gaiden, that typically was given to side story games. That's what it means. But this is an RPG, so let's talk about the storyline first, with no spoilers. The game has a pretty basic, but it is enjoyable storyline. You're a young man named Pike who is blessed with dead parents and an ancient magical talking sword, just like the rest of us, right? Being an orphan, he was raised in a harpy village, with your sister, which gets besieged by evil forces at one point, and your sister gets turned into stone. So Pike ventures out on his adventure to heal his sister and stop the baddies who are trying to resurrect, an ancient evil. And that's when, obviously, an adventure which takes you through about the first 2/3 or so of the game. The storyline's pretty straightforward. There's only minor, twists and turns. Obviously, there's no groundbreaking, literature in this game. And it has a conclusion to sort of the first chapter, and the game changes gears a little bit, and it actually has a second sort of adventure that's loosely related to the first one, with slightly different characters. It's an interesting choice to have a game basically split into 2 chapters like it does, but it does work. It extends the length of the game, even though the sort of second chapter is not as robust as the first chapter. But obviously throughout your adventure, you befriend people that join your party, and, all the classic JRPG tropes are there. Nothing groundbreaking in that sense, but it is a basic and enjoyable, typical sort of JRPG storyline. Now that we know what the game is about, let's break down the good, the just okay, and the ugly Enemy Zero style. The first great thing about the game is the graphics. It really harkens back to the time of epic, awesome sprite work, before everything switched to 3D. There's not a lot of frames of animation, but what there is animated super well, and it has tons of personality, just like the localization. Especially the goofy death animations. And you'll do a lot of battling in the game too, so it's great that that's where the graphics shine. The game is not super flashy in the spell effect department or anything like that, which is kind of disappointing, but the battle backgrounds are actually really good, and they're very varied, and there's lots of, animations in the background, like the sky, the rolling sky and everything. Another great thing is the soundtrack. The soundtracks during the 32-bit era really notably leveled up from the 16-bit era, because obviously CD audio. And Albert Odyssey Legend of Elden was no exception. Sunsoft composer Naoki Kodaka used a combination of the built-in synth tools on the Saturn itself and live instruments to create an epic soundtrack. It's really, really good. And this is one thing that definitely could not have been done on 16-bit systems, obviously. And they lead the music and the sound effects to be very robust and full sounding due to the CD audio, and they really match the game well. I also think that the translation is great and hilarious at times, but I do get that there are definitely working designs detractors out there, okay? I get it. That don't like the humor that they infuse in their translations. I get it. But my opinion is that I'd rather have a quirky English translation of a JRPG than no JRPG at all, having them stuck in Japan. You have to remember that at the time the game came out, it wasn't a guarantee like it is nowadays that anything would get translated and released in the US. JRPGs did not come over to the US all the time like they do nowadays. Nowadays, almost 100% of them get translated or come out with translations already in them. It was not like that in 1996, okay? So working designs was a blessing for early JRPG lovers. Translating and releasing games that might never had a chance to come to America otherwise. So I'll take the quirky translations to have a good, fun English JRPG. So now just the okay. The game's pacing overall, I would say, is just okay, because it does move at a very, very slow pace. Not just from the load times either, but obviously the load times definitely add up over time. You'll do a lot of battling in the game because, like most JRPGs in the day, there's random battles, and the encounter rate is pretty high and the load times are pretty high. So, battles happen quite a lot. And this is even after working designs decreased the encounter rate when they brought it over. That was one of the multiple gameplay improvements that they did in the game. So they decreased the encounter rate by 25-35%, increased the experience you got, and lowered the load times. So this is definitely a huge improvement over the Japanese original, but it still meanders a little bit, and it still makes it drag at times. There is a lot of waiting around in the game for sure. Even in the story, most of the game's story is told through just text-based dialogue, just like old RPGs. It does help contribute to the slower pacing of the games, because unlike a lot of 32-bit RPGs at the time, Albert Odyssey Legend of Elden does not feature a lot of voice acting. There is a little bit in there, but it's super minimal. It's basically only during, key parts of the game, the opening part. And there.
Oh, it's hopeless. We're short of papers. Careful.
Cirrus!
I'm ready. Let's go.
And there are no animated cinemas, just 2D cutscenes, which could be a holdover from it being designed for the Super Nintendo originally, but obviously a lot of RPGs during the CD revolution had started to have fully voiced dialogue and animated cutscenes, sort of like the Lunar games. The fact that the game doesn't have any makes it does stand out quite a lot. And it is a valid criticism of the game. And, having to go through and read all the dialogue, all the major story parts and stuff like that, again, it does slow it down a little bit. And the last thing I think that is just okay would probably be the gameplay overall. There's never been a ton of variation on the classic, turn-based RPG battle formula. But some games, have figured out ways at least to try to do something to change it up. Different attacks, different abilities, meters to build up and something like that. This Albert Odyssey did not. Didn't do nothing. It's as basic can get. It's still fun, but it's very straightforward, and it really drags a little bit on the long boss fights. The monotony of it really starts detracting from the fun of it all, because you're just doing the same attacks over and over again. Attack, attack, heal. Attack, attack, heal. Attack, attack, heal. There's not a lot of variation. And so, it is pretty basic. You have all the JRPG basics here, but nothing else really. During a character's turn, you can, attack, use an item, run, defend, all the classic stuff. Depending on the character, you can use magic attacks or character-specific abilities. So it works, but it doesn't do anything fresh. Doesn't change up the formula at all during the, course of the game. It is pretty bare bones. However, as a counterpoint, one of the great things about the battle system is you actually have 5 members in your party at a time, which is actually great for the time, as most battle systems were only 3 to 4 party members. So that's definitely a plus. That definitely adds a little bit more complexity to it, since you have 5 decisions to make a turn rather than just 3 or 4. But it's pretty average in all those areas, straight down the middle. And now let's talk about the ugly. The only ugly thing I would say about this game are still the load times, which really drag the game down quite a lot. Which, in fairness, are much faster than the Japanese original, like I said before, but they're still quite long, and they really turn some areas of the game into a real snore fest to get through with a high encounter rate. Some of the bigger dungeons, it definitely makes it drag a little bit. And, there's no magic fix to that. Working Designs did what they could. So you definitely got to be patient when you play through this game, for sure. But having said that, overall, I do think that Albert Odyssey Legend of Aldine is a classic 32-bit RPG. It's a little awkwardly stuck in the little void between the 16-bit era and the 32-bit world. It was definitely more advanced than the 16-bit RPGs. You could definitely see that it's definitely more than 16-bit, but it's not quite 32-bit, except for in the soundtrack department. There were definitely a lot more advanced RPGs on the Saturn and the PlayStation that were, better graphically, better gameplay-wise, and, Albert Odyssey, awkwardly occupies the space sort of right in the middle. Right in the middle of the 32-bit and the 16-bit world. But it does shine in a couple areas, specifically the personality of the game. I love the characters, I love the quirky dialogue, I love the personality with the sprite work, the pixel art, oh man. The lovable band of characters, like I said, it definitely hits the nostalgia itch for an old school, turn-based JRPG even today. If you're tired of action RPG systems and you just want to, no-brain it for a little bit, then Albert Odyssey is a great choice to play. I would definitely recommend it for a playthrough if you enjoy turn-based JRPGs. And it's one of those, stuck on the Saturn games that really define the system for me. Nothing groundbreaking, but a very, very charming old school JRPG with a lot of positives and a lot of, straight down the middle sort of mediocre aspects too. But I do love it. I loved it back in the day, and I do think there is some enjoyment to be had with it even in today's age. Stuck on the Saturn. Alright guys, gals, non-binary pals, let me know below what you think about Albert Odyssey Legend of Aldine. If it's worthy of the praise, or if it's garbage, let me know your opinions down below.